This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Festival.
I've seen photographs of fishmongers right on the waterfront where the wharves are, selling right on the street, selling big piles of fresh Dungeness crab. It wasn't a particularly expensive dish even when I was growing up. It would have been expensive probably anywhere except a city that was bordered by Dungeness crab country.
Right. Now it feels very fancy and expensive.
Well, now it is expensive.
It is expensive.
Yeah.
It doesn't just feel expensive. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Sara Bernard.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today, we're digging into a salad, or rather, the origins of crab consumption in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, told through the lens of a very famous and classy dish.
Who invented the Northwest seafood salad everyone loves? Who invented crab louis?
So that is the topic of the video. If you haven't already seen it, we suggest you stop right now, go to the show notes or the show page on crosscut.com and check it out. I believe it was an article in the Seattle PI that you found from the early 20th century saying a trip to Seattle without crab a la Louis is like a trip to Paris without the Eiffel Tower.
I know, so classy. We started to look into this because a viewer wrote in and said, you did a food episode that talked about all these foods that Seattle invented or made famous. And that is reputedly the birth of the Seattle dog. But you didn't include crab louis. And I thought, oh, that's a mistake. But I didn't know that crab louis was from here. So, it's one of those nuggets. It's one of the great things about readers, listeners, viewers. You get these little bits of information. And so I decided to dig into it. And one thing I knew is that crab, seafood, shellfish in particular, consumed in great quantities in Seattle. I mean, indigenous people, the shell middens. Of course, native peoples on the coast had been eating Olympia oysters and clams and other shellfish for thousands of years and left the evidence in old repositories of dining debris we call shell middens. Seattle is known for seafood. We have a fishing fleet that goes and gets the fish and brings it back. We have the Pike Place Market. And I know growing up, salmon and crab were not uncommon on the dinner table, at least at my house. They were often brought out when we had guests from out of town, from New York. It was kind of a way to show off. Like you go to Maine, you get lobster, right?
Right, yeah.
And so my mother would serve Dungeness crab, cracked crab. We'd put a couple of crabs in the middle of the table. People would tear off chunks, crack, eat it. And she used to put bowls at every corner of the table for us to throw the shells in. And we really liked it. We felt like, Vikings or something, getting to throw stuff on the floor. And it wasn't actually on the floor. It was just in the bowl. But yeah, you sort of felt like it was a feast, a regional feast. So I knew that, Seattle had been a place for salmon, for oysters, for crab, fresh crab. And so it didn't surprise me that something like crab louis might have been popularized here. But it turned out the story was more complicated.
As usual. Speaking about our other conversation about folklore, it strikes me that in some level, a recipe could be similar to folklore in that it might be, in some cases, difficult to track down its official origin, because what really counts as its official origin? At what point does it become crab louis?
Right.
I don't know. It seems to me that finding the sort of origin of a recipe could be as difficult as the origin of any kind of like oral history or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And it was true in a number of ways. So I decided to talk to someone who has studied recipes in the Northwest. And there's a scholar named Jacqueline Williams. And she's written books about Northwest frontier cookery and women on the Oregon Trail. What did they eat? How did they prepare it? What kind of kitchen utensils did they use? When did things get better? And so she's made a study of cookbooks, the first cookbooks that were published in the Pacific Northwest. And to do that, you also need to study where those recipes are coming from, because these are people coming from Missouri, or they're coming from Maine or Illinois or someplace else, New England. They're bringing what they want to eat and what they know about, and then they're writing those recipes, and in some cases, they're adding new things. So, for example, I saw some recipes in some of these old books that referred to crab salad. So I asked Jacqueline, could this be the origin of crab louis? And she said, well, you have to be very careful when you see that people, like you read a newspaper story and it says the picnics, they serve crab salad. She said, you know, in the frontier period, that was probably more like tuna salad. In other words, it's mainly mayonnaise-based mixture. So it doesn't necessarily mean what we mean by salad. And then she said you have to be careful about ketchup. Like, one of the elements of crab louis is you've got all this fresh crab and you put it with fresh vegetables, and then you have this red-ish dressing that you put on it. And that can range anywhere from something fairly tart and spicy to Thousand Island dressing. And there's a big spectrum there. And she said, well, ketchup, when you read ketchup in these old recipes, it doesn't necessarily mean tomato ketchup. They made ketchup out of all kinds of fruits and vegetables. They're, ketchups that have oysters in them. They're ketchups. Yeah, I know.
In fact, the tomato part is a relatively recent addition.
They're ketchups with, don't have any tomato in them. They're just other kinds of sauces that are preserved that you might mix. So you can't assume that ketchup in an old recipe means what we mean by ketchup.
But it was the same word, ketchup?
Yeah. And of course, ketchup's spelled a bunch of different ways. But yeah, it's a thing that has evolved. But now it means tomato ketchup. And it means one of a couple of brands that,
right.
Exactly. Everywhere.
Hunt's, Heinz, and that's what it.
So, looking at these recipes, one of the earliest that shows up in a Northwest cookbook is in the early 20th century, pre-World War I. It shows up in a Jewish women's neighborhood cookbook published in Portland. But the key is the Louis dressing. Not just plain mayo, but a zesty and often pink concoction. What we think of as crab Louis. Someone pointed out to me afterwards, that's not kosher.
Oh, right.
Shellfish
are not kosher.
Are not kosher. And so they were wondering, how. So I haven't looked into why, but I'm sure the number of Jewish people in Portland in that time period was probably pretty small. So I think the cookbook was for everybody else.
Yeah.
Our viewers ever alert.
Right.
But so then I just began Googling, and it turns out there are lots of people who have looked into the history of crab louis. And there's all kinds of claims about it. And the claims generally come from, amateur researchers. They come from restaurants themselves, claiming to be the originator of crab louis. There are a couple of restaurants in San Francisco that claim to have originated it early in the 20th century. And they have slightly different recipes. And then moving north, there are people who claimed, James Beard, claimed that crab louis originated at a restaurant in Portland. The Davenport Hotel in Spokane has had crab louis on their menu consistently since 1914. And their founder was named Llewellyn Davenport. And his nickname was Louis. And so they claim that they are the originators of crab louis. But the hotel definitely happened after the Jewish Woman's Cookbook. So
Okay.
One version says that Italian tenor Enrico Caruso came to Seattle. And there's this whole story about how Enrico Caruso came to Seattle and he had a whole bunch of crab louis at either the Olympic Hotel or the Olympic Club. It's uncertain kind of where that happened. And then he made it famous as a Seattle dish. It became kind of a Caruso thing. And turns out not to be true at all. Caruso, as far as I could determine, never came to Seattle.
Like never even appeared in the city ever.
No. So we know he was in San Francisco. We know he was eating. We know he was in the cultural milieu where Crab Louie would have been a big deal. But it wasn't in Seattle.
It wasn't in Seattle. I mean, I guess you probably run into this so much again, this sort of game of telephone that is historical. This, famous Italian tenor came to Seattle and made this very specific dish very famous because he loved it so much. He ate it at this hotel. It's like, but that never happened.
So the people who came out, the settlers who came out on the Oregon Trail, or even if they came by boat or both, they had some food that they might have brought with them, but those supplies would be very short-lasting. So they wouldn't have had lots of wheat. They wouldn't have had sugar, coffee. Those things would be limited. And they didn't really have a lot of livestock with them. So what were they going to eat? Well, they ate an indigenous diet. They basically, when the Denny party got to Seattle, they were completely reliant on the Duwamish people to provide them with game. And so, fortunately, the Duwamish, used to be this massive estuary that was full of ducks.
Man. And
they paid the Duwamish to go and hunt ducks and hunt geese. So they were eating, basically seafood. They were eating salmon. They were eating, shellfish. But they were also eating bird and deer and things that were easily caught. Oh. And it wasn't until they got settled, cleared some land around their homestead, and were able to then have vegetable gardens. Mm. And, that's when you start to see people growing potatoes, lettuce, other kinds of, basic vegetables. So the idea that of fresh produce, it kind of happened here in stages, which are sort of interesting. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you would have in a crab louie would be a lemon. Hmm. Well, you're not thinking about crab and lettuce and lemon in the 1850s or 60s, right? Mm-hmm. It's a while before that kind of meal is even really possible. So it turns out that the Catholic fathers, the padres who came out and set up the missions, many of them brought lemon and orange trees with them and planted those trees in California. And that by the time of the gold rush, or shortly after the gold rush, certainly by the 1860s, late 1850s, there was a commercial citrus market in California. Well, anything happening in San Francisco would come immediately to Seattle because that's where people were coming from. That's where we were shipping lumber. There was a big trade up and down the coast. So suddenly you see in the 1860s in Portland, you can get fruits that are coming in on ships that have been to exotic places. I found an ad. This is from the Vancouver, Washington newspaper from the 1870s, and it's a cigar store. Oh, yeah. And it says, the ad basically is, come in, get any time of the best cigars, and you can get oranges, lemons, figs, dates, and coconuts.
Whoa, coconuts.
Yeah, coconuts is because ships used to have to go to Hawaii to get the winds to come back. Oh. There was this kind of triangle that sailing ships took. Huh. And so, in the early days, you could get a coconut easier than you could get an apple. Wow. In Pioneer, Oregon. So you see that the citrus business and lemons and fruits and things that you can then make preserves out of and stuff starts filtering north. Mm-hmm. And then by the late 1880s, and certainly by the 1890s, once the railroads are going, they're getting stuff from back east. And they're not only getting beef and pork from Chicago and meat and that kind of stuff. They have refrigerated cars, and they're getting fresh lemons from Florida.
Wow.
But they're also getting, instead of just flour and sugar and basics like that, they're getting things like ketchup. They're getting things like Worcestershire sauce.
Yeah, right.
They're getting all these things that sort of begin to go into a more sophisticated Western style diet. And all of these things begin to show up in these crab louis recipes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So somewhere in is where crab salad became crab louis. Somewhere
in there.
We'll be right back.
Support for the Mossback podcast comes from the Crosscut Festival, happening online and in Seattle, May 4th through the 7th. Join us in celebrating bold ideas for a changing world at our biggest event of the year, featuring fireside conversations, panels, live podcast recordings, workshops, and special events that explore forward thinking in politics, social justice, the environment, history, innovation, and more. Spend your week with the community of the curious at the Crosscut Festival this spring. More information at crosscut.com/festival.
Most of my adult life, I lived in the Bay Area, so crab was a big deal there, and Dungeness crab a big deal there. I always remember it being very expensive, though, and I never made any money, so I didn't eat it very often. But, when I moved to Seattle, I think it seems like culturally the relationship with crab was a little closer. For example, I don't recall having any opportunities to go crabbing, quote unquote, myself when I was living in the Bay Area. I don't remember that being a thing. Maybe it was, and I just didn't know the right people. But it seems like you'll hear more stories, or I have run into more people in my experience living in Seattle who actually go and collect some of these shellfish themselves. And so I had this really one opportunity, but this little window into a world that seemed very casual and common to these folks. But one opportunity a few years ago to go crabbing near the San Juans with some people who had a sailboat and crab pots, and that was just what they did. And I guess, that's just a kind of a big, cultural aspect of this region that I was just sort of privy to for them that one weekend. But man, it was incredible. Quintessential Pacific Northwest moment.
Right. One that's thousands of years old,
Yeah.
I think one reason we have more of the crab pots and whatnot is because we're a city, unlike San Francisco, which is on the Pacific, but not on an inland sea in the sense of Puget Sound. So we have the Pacific Ocean that comes in, and it's created this incredible habitat. It's cold water, and there's tons of shoreline, and a lot of people have access to a boat or a summer place, that kind of thing. And that summer ritual of catching the crab and eating them on the beach, and the same with clams and oysters, all of that is just, something a lot of people from here grew up with, and people who come here, they want to experience that.
Speaking of people coming to Seattle and having crab, this sort of iconic thing that you offer, you mentioned that Anthony Bourdain came to Seattle one time, and you met him, or you had a crab meal with him?
It's a very foodie city.
Yeah, I had a seafood lunch with him and a couple of other people down at Taylor Shellfish in Pioneer Square. And this was all set up by his people. This was for his Parts Unknown
Okay.
TV series. And it was in summer of 2017.
Oh, wow.
The last season before his last season. Yeah, and his producers had got in touch with me. They wanted to have some people at lunch to talk about Seattle, and we weren't prepped at all, but it was just, okay, you're going to have lunch at a restaurant, and Tony's going to come in and have lunch with you and just talk for an hour, that kind of a thing.
Wow. So they just found you, production team found you because you're a local historian, journalist?
I was quoted in the New York Times some years ago in an article they did on the origins of chicken teriyaki. And Seattle played a key role in the kind of invention of modern teriyaki and its popularity.
Really?
And it was this very sort of Seattle fast food that craze kind of started here.
Really? So I didn't know this story about teriyaki. Is there a short version of that story that you could tell?
Well, there was a man named Toshi who started a teriyaki place actually right just a couple blocks from where we're sitting.
Oh, really? So near Seattle Center?
Toshi's Teriyaki, and that was like the first, classic teriyaki thing where it's chicken, rice, little salad. And it took off. It became like the fast food for the busy working parent on their way home. Uh-huh. Sounds very nutritious.
Right. When was that?
And this is sometime in the 70s.
Oh, okay.
We can put in the ad for the Mossback episode where we discuss chicken teriyaki. You can watch me eating chicken teriyaki. The classic fast food of Seattle, chicken teriyaki. In 1976. Anyway, so I was quoted in this story, and his producers called me up and said, "Hey, we're thinking of we're coming out to Seattle to do a show. We saw that you talking about teriyaki. We'd like to talk to you about that." So they came out, and I met with them, and we ate teriyaki and talked about it, and talked about the city in general and that kind of thing. And then that was it. And then they called me back and said, "Okay, we're definitely coming to Seattle, and we're going to be here on these dates, and we'd like you to get together with Tony over lunch, and but we don't want to do teriyaki. We're going to do something more seafood oriented." And he'd done stuff out here before. He was no stranger to Seattle. And then they just told me when and where to show up, and the restaurant was open to other people. Uh-huh. So we had a table with cameras kind of all around it so they could shoot different angles. And but then they just started bringing plates of food out. Of course, it was an expense account kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like we had multiple Dungeness crabs. We had these huge platters with every kind of oyster you could want. Uh-huh. They had just had a run of smelt. And they had brought in all this fresh smelt that they'd caught off of Camano Island, and they deep fat quick fried it, so they were like French fries. Wow. They were really good, actually.
Yeah, sounds great.
But anyway, we had this big sort of crab feast, and Bourdain was staying at the Edgewater Hotel downtown on Elliott Bay, and it's famous because rock bands used to stay there, the Beatles or infamously Led Zeppelin stayed there and got into all kinds of shenanigans. But their big thing was you could fish from your window. Oh. This was like Seattle's fanciest waterfront hotel. And what was great about it was they give you a fishing pole and you could like maybe catch a salmon with it.
Oh, wow.
And so he was staying there, and he was very engaging, very conversational, very much exactly the person you see on TV. But he had some really weird things he wanted to talk about. And he was talking about tech bros and how much he didn't like tech bros. And there were a bunch of tech bros at the hotel. And so we were talking about that.
Yeah.
But what he really wanted to talk about was serial killers.
Seattle. If you're looking for a dump site to dispose of the recently killed victim of your serial killing spree, this...
He's like, but my real question for you, historian,
is, why are there so many serial killers in Seattle? And this is a reputation we have because of Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer, and even the Hillside Strangler was caught up in Bellingham. And, there's just this sense that Seattle is a charming, beautiful, natural town, but then it has this kind of dark character. He was very interested in that. Most of this was cut from the actual show.
Yeah, no, I imagine.
You're hearing this is part of the conversation that really didn't make it, much of it make it on air, probably because we weren't into it enough, because I think we were all sort of like, oh, serial killers is a little kind of trite, everywhere has serial killers.
Right.
But then he asked a really creepy question. He said, well, if you killed somebody, how would you dispose of the body? And we all just kind of looked at each other like, what? And he goes, surely you've thought about this. And all of us were like, no, I don't think any of us have. You know, we all looked at each other like, no.
Yeah, like, don't really spend time thinking about that,
Well,
Anthony.
and then I was trying to be accommodating. So I said, well, I guess if I had to, I'd chop them up and put them in a crab pot. And put the pot down in Puget Sound. And there you go.
And there you go.
So it just cracked me up because it was such a kind of a cliche topic in a weird way. But then he still got us to start thinking about, like, what would we do? And I think that part of that was, well, is the reason they're serial killers here is it's so easy to hide a body. Mm. And there is a little truth in that, I think. Mm. Kind of if you look at the context of Ted Bundy, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But
yeah, the landscape somehow has lent itself to hiding
certain kinds of activities.
Yeah. Huh.
So anyway, that was, hopefully he didn't go back to his hotel and try it out.
Right. Oh, God. Yeah. But yeah, way to bring it back to crab, you know? Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by me, Sara Bernard, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. Cover art by Greg Cohen. And many thanks to engineer Rusty Bacall for building out an amazing COVID-friendly audio studio. If you'd like to check out more videos from the 5 seasons of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please review us. It really helps other people find us. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to KCTS9's on-demand programming and a subscription to the Mossback Den newsletter, where Knute shares even more Pacific Northwest history. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Sara Bernard. We'll be back soon with another episode.